On March 15th, 2023, the cameras were rolling on a live Bloomberg television broadcast when the feed cut to Ammar al-Qudairy, the chairman of Saudi National Bank. The journalist asked him a question that, on paper, should have been routine. Would the Saudi National Bank consider increasing its stake in Credit Suisse? Al-Qudairy paused. Then he said two words. Absolutely not. The interview moved on. The journalist nodded. The segment ended. But on the trading floors of Zurich, London, and New York, something catastrophic had already begun. Within hours, Credit Suisse shares collapsed to an all-time low. Within days, one of the oldest and most powerful financial institutions on Earth had ceased to exist as an independent bank. The question that keeps coming back is this: how do two words kill a 167-year-old bank? And the answer, when you dig into it carefully, is that they didn't. The two words were just the last tap on a wall that had been cracking for decades. Credit Suisse was not built the way most banks are built. It was not created to serve wealthy clients or to profit from speculation. It was built to serve a nation. Alfred Escher founded the bank in 1856 with a singular and very practical mission: to finance the construction of Switzerland's railway network. At that moment in history, Switzerland needed capital to build the infrastructure that would connect the country to the rest of Europe. Escher was one of the most powerful political figures in the country, and he understood that no existing European financial institution was going to pour money into Swiss mountains. So he built one himself. From its very first transaction, Credit Suisse was inseparable from the idea of Switzerland itself. It wasn't just a bank that operated in Switzerland. It was a bank that built Switzerland. That institutional identity gave Credit Suisse something that money can't manufacture: trust. Not the kind of trust that comes from a good quarterly earnings report or a slick marketing campaign. The kind of trust that accumulates across generations, across wars, across economic collapses. The kind of trust that makes people believe an institution will still be there long after they're gone. For over a century, that trust compounded. Credit Suisse grew alongside the Swiss economy, financing industry, managing private wealth, and cultivating a reputation for discretion and stability that became part of the global mythology of Swiss banking. The name alone carried weight in boardrooms from Zurich to Singapore. A Credit Suisse relationship was a signal. It said something about who you were and how seriously the world should take you. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, Credit Suisse was not just a bank. It was an institution that existed outside the normal rules of risk and reward, or so the world believed. Then came the ambition. In 1988, after a decade-long partnership, Credit Suisse acquired a controlling stake in First Boston, one of Wall Street's most aggressive investment banks. The deal transformed Credit Suisse from a Swiss wealth manager into a global investment banking powerhouse, competing directly with Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan for the most lucrative mandates on the planet. On paper, it was a logical move. The world was globalizing. Capital markets were expanding. Investment banking was generating returns that made traditional wealth management look pedestrian. Credit Suisse wanted a seat at the biggest table in finance, and it bought one. But the price of that seat wasn't measured in Swiss francs. It was measured in culture. The First Boston acquisition injected an American-style risk appetite directly into the bloodstream of a Swiss institution that had been defined for over a century by caution, discretion, and the long view. These were not compatible philosophies. They were oil and water dressed up in the same suit. The firm began attracting a different kind of banker, not people who came to Credit Suisse because they believed in its identity or its history, but people who came because the bonuses were large and the platform was global. The institutional DNA began to shift, slowly, quietly, in ways that nobody at the board level seemed to notice or chose to acknowledge. The first real stress test of this new identity came in 2008. The global financial crisis nearly killed Credit Suisse. The bank reported a full-year net loss of 8.2 billion Swiss francs, one of the worst results in its history. Investment banking revenues swung from positive 1.7 billion francs in the fourth quarter of 2007 to negative 5.3 billion francs a year later, a swing of over 7 billion francs in 12 months. The dividend was slashed from 2.50 francs per share to just 10 centimes, a single coin, a symbolic collapse of shareholder confidence. But here is where the story gets complicated. Credit Suisse survived. Unlike its crosstown rival UBS, which required a massive government bailout and was rescued only through a combination of Swiss National Bank intervention and emergency state capital, Credit Suisse navigated the crisis without public money. It raised approximately 10 billion francs in capital independently and maintained one of the strongest capital ratios in the global banking industry at 13.3%. CEO Brady Dugan went on record saying the bank had a strong start to 2009 and was profitable across all divisions. The markets agreed. The worst was apparently over. But that survival planted a seed that would eventually destroy the institution. The lesson Credit Suisse took from 2008 was not humility. It was not a recognition that the American-style risk culture imported from First Boston had nearly cost them everything. The lesson the bank took from 2008 was that it was special, that it was smarter, leaner, and more nimble than its competitors. That while lesser institutions were collapsing and begging governments for help, Credit Suisse had found a way through on its own terms. This became the founding myth of Credit Suisse's post-crisis identity. The rescue of UBS left the Credit Suisse leadership with a deeply dangerous belief that the rules that applied to everyone else simply did not apply to them. That belief would cost them everything, but it would take another 15 years and a cascade of increasingly spectacular failures to prove it. In May 2014, Credit Suisse entered a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., and pleaded guilty to a criminal charge of conspiracy to aid and abet tax evasion. It was the largest financial institution to admit to a criminal charge in the United States in 15 years. The penalties totaled approximately $2.6 billion. The scheme had spanned decades. Credit Suisse bankers had been actively, systematically, and deliberately helping wealthy American clients hide assets from the Internal Revenue Service. This wasn't a rogue trader operating in a dark corner. This was institutional behavior, sustained across multiple leadership teams, across multiple decades, embedded in the way the bank served its most profitable clients. The guilty plea should have been a reckoning. It should have triggered a fundamental re-examination of the culture that had allowed this to happen. Instead, the bank's CEO at the time stood before the cameras and said that operations would continue as normal. The market shrugged. The fine was paid, the headlines faded, and Credit Suisse drew exactly the wrong conclusion. It concluded that scandals were survivable. It concluded that fines were simply a line item, a cost of doing business no different from rent or payroll. It concluded that the world would keep trusting Credit Suisse regardless of what Credit Suisse actually did. This was the moment the pattern was set, and the pattern would repeat itself over and over and over for the next 9 years. 5 years after the tax evasion plea, the problems became personal in a way that shocked even the most cynical observers of corporate governance. In September 2019, it emerged that Credit Suisse had hired private investigators to conduct physical surveillance on Iqbal Khan, a former executive who had left the bank to join rival UBS. The surveillance was not metaphorical. Investigators were following Khan through the streets of Zurich, tracking his movements, monitoring his contacts. When Khan confronted one of his apparent tails on a Zurich street, a confrontation ensued that ended with the police being called. The story made international headlines. COO Pierre-Olivier Bouet, who had authorized the surveillance operation, resigned. A security consultant linked to the operation was later found dead, an apparent suicide. CEO Tidjane Thiam initially denied any knowledge of what had been authorized under his leadership, but was forced to resign in February 2020 after the board concluded that the scandal had caused catastrophic reputational damage that was impossible to contain. Think about what this moment represented. This was not a rogue trader, a bad loan, or a compliance failure buried in a spreadsheet. This was the leadership of one of the world's most important financial institutions authorizing private investigators to physically follow a former employee through the streets of the city where the bank was headquartered. The rules, it turned out, applied to everyone except the people running Credit Suisse. And the culture that had quietly been building since the First Boston acquisition, The culture that believed Credit Suisse was above the normal constraints that governed lesser institutions was now visible to everyone. Then came the double catastrophe of 2021, and it hit the bank like a freight train traveling at full speed into a wall. In March of that year, Greensill Capital, a supply chain finance company that had been treated as a blue-chip client, collapsed without warning. Credit Suisse had funneled approximately $10 billion of client money into Greensill-linked supply chain finance funds. When Greensill went under, those funds had to be frozen immediately. Clients who had trusted Credit Suisse with their capital suddenly discovered that their money was locked inside a product tied to a company that no longer existed. The reputational damage was severe, but the bank had barely absorbed the Greensill shock when the second wave hit. Days after the Greensill collapse, Archegos Capital Management, a family office run by Bill Huang, imploded under the weight of massively leveraged bets on media stocks. Credit Suisse took a charge of 4.7 billion Swiss francs from the Archegos default, the single largest client-related loss in the bank's modern history. Two senior leaders, investment banking head Brian Chin and chief risk officer Laura Warner, were dismissed. An internal investigation later found that risk managers had flagged the bank's Archegos exposure well before the collapse. Their warnings had been overruled by the people prioritizing revenue generation. This was the turning point. Every scandal before Archegos could be framed as a legacy problem, a historical failure being addressed by new management with better systems and stronger oversight. Archegos ended that narrative entirely. This was not a legacy problem. This was a bank that could not manage risk in real time because the people responsible for controlling risk were being systematically ignored by the people responsible for generating revenue. FINMA, the Swiss financial regulator, would later issue a report describing the fundamental failure as cultural. The culture was the risk, and that culture was not changing. The scandals continued arriving with a relentlessness that became almost difficult to track. 3 former Credit Suisse bankers had already been arrested in connection with a $2 billion loan fraud in Mozambique, with at least $200 million allegedly diverted through corruption. An investigation involving 48 international news organizations had published revelations about Credit Suisse accounts held by dictators, war criminals, intelligence operatives, and organized crime figures. In June 2022, Credit Suisse became the first major Swiss bank in history to face a criminal conviction in Switzerland. Found guilty of failing to prevent a Bulgarian drug trafficking gang from laundering approximately 146 million francs through its accounts. And in one of the most painful pieces of corporate irony in recent memory, Antonio Horta Osorio, the chairman who had been brought in specifically to reform Credit Suisse's governance and culture, was himself forced out in January 2022 after repeatedly breaching COVID quarantine rules. The reformer had publicly violated the very rules he had been hired to enforce. Any single one of these failures might have been survivable in isolation. Banks absorb scandals. They pay fines, fire executives, restructure leadership teams, and continue operating. What made Credit Suisse different was not the severity of any individual crisis, but the relentless, unceasing accumulation of them. There was no breathing room. There was no stable period long enough for institutional memory to fade. Each new scandal arrived before the damage from the previous one had healed, and each new scandal reinforced the same underlying story, that Credit Suisse was a bank that could not be trusted to govern itself. By October 2022, that story had become so dominant in the market that even a rumor was enough to trigger disaster. Social media speculation about the bank's solvency, much of it false and much of it amplified by anonymous accounts, triggered the largest deposit flight since the 2008 financial crisis. Over 110 billion Swiss francs were withdrawn from Credit Suisse in the fourth quarter of 2022 alone, compared to just 12.9 billion in the quarter immediately before. In a single 3-month period, clients pulled out nearly $100 billion more than they had in any previous quarter. The bank attempted a massive restructuring, including a 4 billion franc capital raise. The Saudi National Bank and the Qatar Investment Authority came in as anchor shareholders, with Saudi National Bank taking a 9.9% stake. The investment was presented to the market as a vote of confidence, a signal from major sovereign wealth funds that Credit Suisse had a credible future. In reality, it was a life preserver thrown to a drowning institution. In February 2023, Credit Suisse reported a full-year net loss of 7.3 billion francs for 2022, its worst annual result since the financial crisis. But the number that told the real story was not the loss itself. It was the client outflows, an annual outflow of 123.2 billion francs. 60% of that had left in the final quarter. The people who had trusted Credit Suisse with their money had made their decision. They were leaving, and they were not coming back. Then came March 15th. Ammar al-Khuderi's absolutely not was not, in any technical sense, a statement about Credit Suisse's viability. He was referring to a regulatory cap that prevented Saudi National Bank from increasing its ownership stake beyond 9.9% without triggering a fresh regulatory approval process. The statement had nothing to do with the bank's balance sheet, its liquidity position, or its ability to meet its obligations. In a functioning institution with intact credibility, the comment would have been reported as a minor regulatory footnote. But Credit Suisse was not a functioning institution with intact credibility. It was a bank that had spent 15 years destroying the one asset that central banks cannot print and regulators cannot mandate: trust. And in the absence of trust, the market heard what it was already conditioned to hear. The bank's biggest new investor was walking away. Within hours of the broadcast, Swiss National Bank announced an emergency liquidity backstop of 50 billion francs. The announcement confirmed every fear instead of calming them. When a central bank has to announce emergency support for one of the country's two largest private banks in the middle of a business day, the situation is not under control. On March 19th, 2023, after a weekend of emergency negotiations conducted under extraordinary pressure from the Swiss government, UBS agreed to acquire Credit Suisse. The price was 3 billion Swiss francs. A bank that had carried an 81 billion franc market capitalization in better times was sold for less than the assessed value of its own Zurich headquarters. The Swiss government passed emergency legislation to bypass the shareholder vote that would normally have been required under Swiss corporate law. Approximately 16 billion francs in Credit Suisse's additional tier 1 bonds were written down to zero, completely wiping out those bondholders. Equity holders received some compensation, which produced a deeply unusual outcome. Shareholders were better protected than bondholders. This inverted the normal hierarchy of losses in a financial failure, where debt holders are supposed to be protected before equity, and it sent shockwaves through European credit markets that took months to fully absorb. There is a tendency, when analyzing the collapse of major institutions, to search for the single fatal decision, the one moment when everything changed. The rogue trader who broke the system, the one bad bet that blew up the balance sheet, the single executive whose arrogance or incompetence brought down the whole structure. Credit Suisse resists that analysis because it doesn't fit that template. The bank cycled through 5 chief executives in its final decade. Every one of them arrived with a restructuring plan. Every one of them promised that this time the culture would change, the standards would be enforced, and the era of scandal was behind them. Every one of them failed, not because they were uniquely incompetent or dishonest, but because the problem they were trying to fix was not located in the C-suite. It was located in the institutional belief embedded at every level of the organization that Credit Suisse was too important, too globally systemic, and too clever to face genuine existential consequences. 5 CEOs came and went. The belief remained. Credit Suisse was one of 30 banks in the world classified as a global, systemically important bank when it failed, meaning regulators had determined that its collapse would pose a direct threat to the stability of the global financial system. It had the capital ratios. It met the regulatory requirements. The supervisory frameworks existed. The FINME oversight apparatus was functioning. None of it mattered, because the frameworks can only work if the institution inside them is genuinely committed to operating within their spirit and not merely satisfying their letter. A bank that treats every regulatory fine as an acceptable business expense, that treats every whistleblower as a threat to be neutralized, that treats every risk warning as an obstacle to the next quarter's revenue, will eventually accumulate enough damage that no capital ratio in the world can save it. Credit Suisse survived 2008 because it was resilient. It survived the tax evasion scandal because it was large. It survived the spy scandal because it was important. It survived Greensill and Archegos because the market was willing to give it one more chance. What it could not survive was the compounding weight of all of them together, arriving without pause, without breathing room, without a single extended period of stability in which trust could begin to rebuild. And that, more than any specific decision or any specific executive, is the mechanism of collapse. Trust, once it begins to erode, does not erode linearly. It holds and holds and holds until the moment it doesn't, and then it goes all at once. 2 words on a Bloomberg feed. A pause before an answer that lasted slightly too long. A Saudi banker explaining a regulatory technicality to a journalist on a Tuesday morning. In another world, in another institution, that moment passes. The clip runs. The interview ends. The market moves on. But Credit Suisse was not another institution. It was a building that had been losing bricks for 15 years while telling everyone the structure was sound. When Amr al-Qudari said absolutely not, he didn't knock the building down, he just walked past it at the exact moment it had decided it couldn't stand anymore. The end of Credit Suisse is not primarily a story about bad trading decisions or regulatory failures or individual misconduct. It is a story about what happens when an institution decides that its history is a shield against accountability. It is a story about the gap between the bank you market yourself as being and the bank you have actually become. And it is a story that should concern everyone who believes that the size of an institution's balance sheet is a reliable indicator of its integrity. Because the balance sheet at Credit Suisse was enormous right up until the moment it was worth 3 billion francs and a weekend of emergency phone calls. The numbers were fine until they weren't. The trust was gone long before the numbers caught up. And that is what makes this collapse different from almost any other in modern banking history. The institution did not fail because it ran out of money. It failed because it had spent 15 years running out of something that no central bank has ever managed to print. If you want to understand which companies are showing the same early warning signs today, the same pattern of manageable scandals and ignored risk warnings and institutional arrogance that precedes the kind of collapse you've just watched, that's exactly what I cover in my newsletter. Distressed debt, leveraged finance, corporate governance failures, and the structures underneath the headlines that tell you where things are actually heading. The link is in the description, and if you want to see how other institutions convinced themselves they were too important to fail, click on the videos above.